In the heart of Manhattan, inside a restaurant so exclusive it breathed secrecy, Maya's hands trembled. It wasn't fear, but the bone-deep exhaustion of a life lived on the edge. She moved with a practiced invisibility between tables laden with crystal and silver. Her target was a smug politician, his smile as slick as the pomade in his hair. Then, a careless nudge from another guest, a fractional loss of balance. The world slowed. The porcelain tureen of scalding bisque tilted, a wave of creamy orange cascading down the front of his $1,000 suit. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. The man's face, moments before a mask of condescending charm, contorted into a canvas of pure, unadulterated rage. But the storm that came was not the one she expected, and the man watching from the shadows would change her life forever. If you want to discover the price she was forced to pay, watch until the end. Subscribe now and let us know in the comments what you would have done. You incompetent little fool. The politician's voice sliced through the silence, sharp and venomous. He shot up from his chair, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger. Do you have any idea what this suit costs? It's more than you'll make in a year. The words were designed to strip her bare, to reduce her to nothing more than a clumsy servant in front of an audience of the city's elite. His insults rained down, each one a stone, while Maya stood frozen, the heat of shame rising in her cheeks, far more scalding than the soup. The other patrons looked away, studying their wine glasses, their polished shoes, anything to avoid witnessing the brutal, public dissection of a person's dignity. Their silence was a verdict, and she had been found guilty of being poor. Her name was Maya Alvarez, 26 years old, and she was a ghost long before she learned to move silently through this restaurant. Every dollar she earned, every extra shift she took, was a desperate prayer for her younger sister, whose illness was a relentless thief, stealing not only her health but their future. This job wasn't a career. It was a battlefield where she fought for survival with a polite smile and an aching back. Her resilience was a shield forged in the fires of loss, having buried her parents far too young. She had nothing left to her name but a fierce, quiet integrity and the crushing weight of responsibility. In this opulent room, surrounded by unimaginable wealth, she was fighting for something far more valuable, a single, precious life. The exhaustion that settled in her bones was more than physical. It was the spiritual weariness of a fundamentally decent person navigating a predatory world. She had been taught that honesty and hard work were virtues, but all they had brought her was vulnerability. Yet she refused to break. As the politician continued his tirade, something shifted behind her eyes. The initial shock gave way to a cold, clear defiance. She met his furious gaze, her own dark eyes reflecting not fear, but a profound disappointment in his cruelty. She wouldn't cry, wouldn't give him the satisfaction. This quiet strength, this refusal to be diminished, was an act of rebellion he could never understand. It was the only power she had, and she wielded it in the stillness of her posture. The restaurant itself seemed to conspire against her. The low amber lighting, once a source of intimate warmth, now felt like an interrogator's lamp, pinning her in place. The gentle melody of a lone cello in the corner soured, its melancholic notes now sounding like a dirge for her career. The clinking of distant silverware felt like the ticking of a clock, counting down the seconds to her dismissal. Even the air, thick with the aromas of truffle oil and aged wine, felt suffocating, a rich man's atmosphere she was no longer worthy of breathing. Every sensory detail of this luxurious world served as a reminder of her otherness, a stark line drawn between the powerful and the powerless. She was an unwelcome stain on their perfect gilded canvas. This moment was a microcosm of her entire existence. She was perpetually trapped, not just by the walls of this restaurant, by a system designed to keep her in her place. The abusive manager who skimmed her tips, the landlord who threatened eviction over a late payment, the predatory interest rates on loans she took for her sister's medicine, they were all faces of the same monster. Her innate sense of justice, the belief that people should be kind, felt like a foolish, childish notion in the city of wolves. She looked at the furious politician, a man who held the power to shatter her fragile life over a simple accident, and felt the chasm between their worlds widen into an uncrossable abyss. In his eyes, she wasn't a person, she was an inconvenience. Just as the manager began to scurry toward their table, his face a mask of panicked apology, the atmosphere in the room changed. It wasn't a sound, but a sudden, profound shift in pressure, as if the air itself had grown heavy. The politician's voice faltered, the momentum of his rage inexplicably broken. The ambient chatter, which had begun to tentatively resume, died once more. This time into a silence that was not awkward, but reverent and fearful. Maya, still locked in her silent standoff, felt a prickling on the back of her neck. A gaze, cold and impossibly heavy, had settled upon her from the darkest corner of the room.
It was a look that held no judgment, no pity, only a chilling, absolute focus. The game had just changed, and a new player had silently taken the board. Her day began long before the sun dared to touch the steel and glass canyons of Manhattan. The shrill cry of a cheap digital alarm clock sliced through the silence of her small, sparsely furnished room in Queens. The air was perpetually cold, the radiator a fickle companion that offered warmth on its own terms. She moved through the pre-dawn gloom with a practiced economy of motion, a silent ballet of survival. Every object in her apartment, the worn armchair, the single chipped mug, the stack of overdue bills on the counter, was a testament to a life lived on the defensive, a constant battle against the encroaching tide of financial ruin. The city hummed with promise outside her window, but for Maya, it was a predator, and she was learning to be very, very quiet to avoid its gaze. The journey into the city's heart was a daily exercise in erasure. Pressed among a throng of anonymous bodies on the subway, she became just another face in the crowd, her individuality dissolving into the collective weariness of the morning commute. The train rattled and screeched, a mechanical beast devouring the miles between her world and theirs. She would watch the other passengers, their faces illuminated by the cold blue light of their phones, and wonder about their burdens. Did they too feel this suffocating weight, this sense that they were perpetually one misstep away from falling? In these moments, surrounded by millions, her solitude felt most profound, a silent scream in a crowded car, hurtling through the darkness beneath the city. The restaurant, a gilded cage of hushed tones and exorbitant prices, was managed by a man named Henderson, whose smile never quite reached his eyes. He ruled his small kingdom with a quiet, insidious cruelty, finding pleasure in the small humiliations he could inflict upon his staff. He would critique a server's posture in front of a guest, or forget to log their overtime, his apologies as thin as the polished veneer on the mahogany bar. For Maya, he was the embodiment of the system that held her captive, a man with a sliver of power who used it not to build but to diminish. She learned to navigate his moods, to offer a placid, unreadable expression that gave him no purchase, no emotional reaction to feed upon. Her uniform was a second skin of servitude, crisp, black, and impersonal. Putting it on each evening was a ritual of transformation. She was no longer Maya Alvarez, a woman with dreams and sorrows. She was a function, an extension of the restaurant's ambiance. The starchy fabric was a constant reminder of her place, a barrier between her true self and the wealthy patrons she served. It was both armor and cage, protecting her from their casual disdain, while simultaneously trapping her within a role they expected her to play. She would fasten the final button, smooth the apron, and take a deep breath, consciously burying her own identity beneath layers of professional deference before stepping onto the floor. The reason for this relentless self-abnegation lived in a small, sunlit photograph tucked into the corner of her locker door. Her younger sister, Sophia, smiled out at her, a vibrant, hopeful grin from a time before the illness had taken root. Sophia was the anchor of Maya's world, the singular focus of her struggle. Every dollar earned, every insult swallowed was for her. The mounting medical bills were a stack of white paper dragons she had to slay night after night. This wasn't just a job, it was a desperate, unending campaign to buy time, to purchase another day of hope for the only person left in her life who mattered. This love was her fuel, but it was also the chain that bound her to this life. When her shift ended, often in the cold, early hours of the morning, she would reverse her journey, traveling from the epicenter of wealth back to the quiet margins. The silence of her apartment would rush in to meet her, a stark contrast to the orchestrated symphony of the restaurant. There was no one to ask about her day, no one to share the small victories or the stinging defeats. The loneliness was a physical presence, a cold spot in the center of the room. It was in these quiet moments that the facade crumbled, and the sheer weight of her existence would press down on her, leaving her hollowed out and aching with a fatigue that went far deeper than her bones. In a dusty box beneath her bed lay the ghost of another life, a set of architectural drafting tools and a portfolio of intricate, imaginative drawings. She had once dreamed of building things, of creating spaces that offered beauty and sanctuary. Now she serves people in spaces she could never afford to enter as a guest. Sometimes, late at night, she would take out the sketchbook and let her pencil drift, designing impossible, beautiful structures that defied gravity and convention. It was a small, secret act, a way of reminding herself that the woman in the black uniform was not all that she was, or all that she was meant to be. The pressure was not just emotional, but tangible, arriving in thin paper envelopes with transparent windows. The red ink of a final notice seemed to bleed through the paper, a written threat that made her heart pound. Each bill was a link in a chain, connecting her sister's health to her own servitude. The numbers swam before her eyes, an insurmountable sum that grew with each passing day. This constant, grinding financial anxiety was a form of violence, a slow erosion of her spirit. It dictated every choice, forcing her to accept mistreatment, to work until she was numb, because the alternative, failing Sophia, was simply unthinkable. It was a trap with no visible bars, but it was a prison all the same. That evening, the oppression took the form of a simple, searing injustice. A powerful hedge fund manager, a regular at the restaurant, claimed his steak was overcooked, though it was prepared exactly to his specifications. He didn't raise his voice. His complaint was delivered with a cold, dismissive wave of his hand that was far more insulting. Henderson, ever the sycophant, immediately sided with the customer, forcing Maya to offer a profuse, humiliating apology for a mistake she hadn't made. She stood there, absorbing the blame, her face a mask of polite contrition while a fire of righteous anger burned in her chest. She swallowed her pride, just as she always did, because she had no other choice. After the incident, she retreated to the kitchen for a moment, leaning against the cool stainless steel of a prep table. The cacophony of clattering dishes and shouted orders was a welcome distraction. She closed her eyes, took a single deep breath, and rebuilt her walls. She could not afford to break. Not now, not ever. Straightening her spine, she smoothed her apron one last time, the fabric a familiar weight against her. Her face settled back into the carefully constructed mask of professional calm. She pushed through the swinging doors, stepping back into the low lights and quiet murmurs of the dining room, entirely unaware that she was walking toward the end of one life and the violent, uncertain beginning of another. He sat in the darkest corner of the room, a place where shadows pooled like ink, making him more of a presence than a person. Damian Valeriano did not need the light. Power was his illumination, and it radiated from him in cold, silent waves. He was a man sculpted from stillness, his dark, impeccably tailored suit a second skin that seemed to absorb the ambient warmth and light around him. Two men,
equally silent and severe, stood at a discreet distance, their purpose unmistakable yet unobtrusive. The table before him was stark, a glass of amber liquid, untouched, and his hands resting calmly on the white linen. He had been observing the room's petty dramas with a detached, almost academic interest, a king watching the clumsy games of children from his throne. The politician's shrill, entitled rage was a discordant note in the carefully orchestrated symphony of the evening. Damien watched the scene unfold, his expression unreadable, his gaze fixed not on the aggressor, but on the girl. He saw her stand her ground, not with defiance, but with the quiet, unyielding dignity that was out of place in this room as a wildflower in a sterile vault. He saw the tremor in her hands, the shame she refused to let blossom into tears, and the core of integrity she held onto like a shield. In a world of transactional relationships and performative emotions, her authenticity was a stark, jarring anomaly. It was this, her refusal to be broken by a lesser man's cruelty, that finally captured his complete and undivided attention. With a movement so subtle it was almost subliminal, Damien lifted a single finger from the table. It was not a grand gesture, not a command meant to be seen, but an electrical impulse that shot across the room and found its target with lethal precision. The politician, mid-sentence, choked on his own words. His face, once flushed with fury, turned a pasty, ashen white. The bravado evaporated, replaced by a raw, primal fear that widened his eyes and slackened his jaw. He had seen the signal and understood its meaning perfectly. The hierarchy of the city's predators had just been brutally reasserted, and he was nothing more than prey that had foolishly drawn the attention of the apex. The silence that followed was thick with terror. Then Damien's gaze shifted, moving from the now cowering politician to settle fully upon Maya. It was a physical force, a weight that pressed down on her, stripping away the noise and the onlookers until it was only the two of them in the vast, silent room. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, hold no warmth, no pity. They were analytical, intelligent, and carried the profound weariness of a man who had witnessed the very worst of human nature and was no longer surprised. He looked at her not as a clumsy waitress, but as a puzzle he was compelled to solve. She felt utterly exposed, seen to the very marrow of her bones by a man who understood the currency of fear better than anyone. He rose, his movement a study in contained power, fluid, deliberate, and utterly silent. The room held its collective breath as he crossed the polished marble floor, his presence eclipsing everything else. He ignored the terrified politician and the fawning manager, his path unwavering, his destination absolute. He stopped directly in front of Maya, so close she could feel the cold radiating from the fine wool of his suit and catch the subtle, clean scent of sandalwood and winter air. He was taller than she'd imagined, an imposing figure who blotted out the rest of the world. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage, caught between the instinct to flee and the paralyzing force of his proximity. His voice, when he finally spoke, was nothing like the politician's angry shriek. It was a low, resonant murmur, like stones shifting in a deep riverbed, meant for her ears alone. "Perfect," he said. The word was a paradox, cold and sharp, yet delivered with a strange, unnerving calm. It made no sense in the context of the spilled soup and the public humiliation. It wasn't a compliment or a judgment, it was a declaration, a final, closing statement on the events that had transpired. For a terrifying moment, she thought he was mocking her, enjoying the spectacle of her ruin. But his eyes held no amusement, only that same unnerving, calculating intensity, as if her disaster had somehow aligned perfectly with the purpose only he could comprehend. He looked past her, his gaze sweeping over the gawking patrons with a flicker of profound contempt. "Now you will pay," he continued, his voice dropping even lower, drawing her into a conspiracy of two. "For one night." A sordid whisper rippled through the nearest tables as the audience misinterpreted his meaning, their minds filling in the blanks with cheap, predictable vulgarity. Maya flinched, the implication a fresh wave of humiliation. But Damien's eyes remained locked on hers, and he seemed to read the fear and disgust on her face. He held her gaze, demanding her attention, refusing to let her look away as he delivered the final, critical part of his decree, a clarification that would shatter every assumption. But not in the way these animals are thinking. The disdain in his voice was palpable, a quiet venom directed at the very people who both feared and revered him. He leaned in a fraction of an inch, the space between them charged with a dangerous electric current. You will pay with your time, with your honesty. The proposition was so strange, so unexpected, that it momentarily eclipsed her fear. He wasn't demanding servitude or submission in the way she understood it. He was asking for something intangible, something she hadn't realized was a commodity, her character. He was a man who lived in a world of lies, and he had just seen something real. In that suspended moment, as she stared into his dark, unreadable eyes, she saw it, a flicker of something other than cold control. It was a flash of deep, ancient loneliness, a wound so carefully guarded that its very existence was a secret. He, in turn, saw not her poverty or her position, but the fierce, unbroken light of her spirit. He saw the moral clarity he himself had sacrificed long ago on the altar of power and survival. It was a silent, unwilling recognition across an impossible divide. She was his opposite, a reflection of a path not taken, and the realization both fascinated and disturbed him in a way nothing had in years. The fear was still there, but now it was threaded with a terrifying and inexplicable curiosity. Without another word, he straightened up, gave a curt, dismissive nod to the manager, and turned to leave. His departure was as quiet and absolute as his arrival. The spell broke, and the room exhaled, the sound a ragged, collective sigh of relief. The politicians scurried away, and the ambient chatter slowly, cautiously returned. But for Maya, the world had been fundamentally altered. The politicians' insults were a faded memory, drowned out by the echo of Damien Valeriano's low voice and the phantom weight of his gaze. She stood frozen in place long after he was gone, the air still seeming to hold the ghost of his presence, a chilling promise of a debt that had yet to be collected. The summons came not as a command, but as an offer she couldn't refuse. A sleek black car, silent as a phantom, was waiting for her after her shift, its driver a statue with a chauffeur's cap. There was no explanation, only an address whispered on a heavy card. Fear, cold and sharp, coiled in her stomach, but the memory of Damien Valeriano's eyes was more compelling than her terror. She got in. The leather seats were cool against her skin, the silent glide of the car through the city streets a journey into another dimension. She was crossing a threshold, leaving the familiar world of struggle and grit for a landscape of shadows and unspoken power. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was the first payment of her debt. The car delivered her to a private elevator that opened directly into a penthouse suite overlooking the glittering expanse of Central Park. The room was a masterpiece of minimalist luxury, dark wood, gray silk, and vast panes of glass that made the city lights feel like a captive audience. Damien was standing by the window, a silhouette against the urban constellations, the untouched glass of amber liquid once again on a table beside him. He didn't turn as she entered, yet she felt his awareness of her in every atom of the silent, conditioned air. This was his world, a place of immense, quiet power, and she was a foreign element, a fragile variable introduced into his perfect, cold equation. Her simple, worn coat felt like a costume in this cathedral of wealth. He finally turned, his eyes sweeping over her, not with judgment, but with that same unnerving, analytical intensity. "Tell me about your sister," he said, his voice a low murmur that seemed to be absorbed by the thick carpets. The question was a disarming maneuver, a scalpel slicing through her defenses to touch the most vulnerable part of her. She hesitated, her throat tight. Lying to this man seemed impossible, a fool's errand. So she spoke, her voice trembling at first, then steadying as she described Sophia's illness, the relentless hope, the crushing bills. She revealed the raw, honest truth of her life, and he just listened, his face an unreadable mask, absorbing her words like a dark star absorbing light. Their meetings became a strange, unspoken ritual. He never summoned her in the same way twice. Sometimes he would be sitting in a quiet corner of the small independent bookstore she frequented, a heavy volume of philosophy open but unread in his hands. Other times, she would exit the subway station near her apartment and see his car parked across the street, a dark, patient predator waiting in the urban jungle. He never approached her during these moments, never spoke. It was just his presence, a silent acknowledgement that he was watching, that her life was now a territory he patrolled. The feeling was deeply unsettling, a violation of her privacy that was paradoxically threaded with a bizarre sense of protection. Maya found herself caught in an emotional undertow, pulled between two powerful currents. The first was a deep instinctual fear. She knew who he was, what he represented. His world was built on violence and intimidation, a moral universe so alien to her own that it should have been repulsive. Yet the second current was a powerful, undeniable fascination. He was the only person who had ever looked at her and seen not a servant or a victim, but a person of substance. His quiet, focused attention was a form of respect she had never known from the powerful men she served every night. She began to look for his car, to scan the shadows for his silhouette, her fear slowly transmuting into a dangerous, addictive anticipation. Damien, too, was fighting a war within himself. She was a complication, an anomaly he should have excised after that first night. Her unwavering moral compass was a silent indictment of the man he had become. Every honest word she spoke, every flicker of defiant dignity in her eyes chipped away at the fortress of cynicism he had built around his heart for decades. He told himself he was merely studying her, a curious specimen of an extinct species. But he knew it was a lie. He was drawn to the light she carried within her, a warmth he had forgotten could exist, and the proximity to it was both a comfort and an agony. Protecting that light was becoming an impulse that defied all logic and self-preservation. One rainy afternoon, as she was leaving a pharmacy with another desperately expensive prescription for Sophia, a man bumped into her, knocking the bag from her hand. As she bent to retrieve it, he snatched her purse and sprinted away. Before a scream could even form in her throat, a figure detached from a nearby doorway. It was one of Damien's men, moving with a fluid, lethal grace. He didn't run, he simply intercepted the thief's path, a single brutal movement sending the man to the pavement. Her purse was returned to her trembling hands without a word. The silent sentinel simply nodded once, melted back into the rain-slicked street, and was gone. Maya stood there, her heart pounding, clutching her bag, knowing with absolute certainty who had sent her guardian angel. The next time she saw him was at a private gallery viewing he had arranged. The space was empty save for the two of them and priceless works of modern art. "The man from the other day," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "thank you." He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on a chaotic canvas of black and crimson paint. "I employ competent people," he stated, the words a cold dismissal of her gratitude. But she stepped closer, emboldened by a strange courage. That wasn't competence, that was a message. He finally turned his head, his eyes locking with hers. For a moment, the mask slipped, and she saw a flash of something raw and weary, the immense burden of the violence that kept his world in order. A week later, she learned that an anonymous donor had paid off the entirety of Sophia's outstanding medical debt. The hospital administrator could give her no details, only that the sum had been settled in full. There was only one person in the world who could have done it. When she confronted him during their next silent meeting in a deserted corner of a city park, he showed no reaction. "I know it was you," she insisted, her voice thick with a confusing mix of gratitude and anger. He watched a child chase pigeons across the gravel path before answering, his voice soft. A debt was owed, it was paid. He used his own dark money to save a life, a moral transgression that felt more profound than any sin. The invisible line between them grew thinner with each encounter. He started to speak more, not about his business, but about abstract things, the architecture of a building, the flawed logic of a philosopher, the melancholy of a particular piece of classical music playing softly in the background. She, in turn, found herself challenging him, questioning his cynical view of the world with a quiet but firm conviction. They were two opposing forces, his darkness and her light locked in a slow, gravitational pull. They were creating a third space between them, a small, fragile reality that belonged only to them, where the normal rules of their respective worlds no longer seemed to apply. The physical tension was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of their interactions. It was in the way his gaze would linger on her face a second too long, tracing the curve of her cheekbone as if committing it to memory. It was in the way she became hyper-aware of his proximity, the subtle scent of his cologne, the warmth that radiated from him when he stood near. One evening, as they walked along the river, a sudden gust of wind blew a strand of hair across her face. Before she could react, he reached out, his fingers brushing her cheek as he tucked the strand behind her ear. The touch was feather-light, accidental, yet it sent a jolt of electricity through her entire body. They both froze, the moment stretching into an eternity of unspoken feeling. He pulled his hand back as if burned, his composure fracturing for a brief, breathtaking second. In his eyes, she saw a storm of conflict, desire warring with a deeply ingrained control, a flicker of longing swiftly extinguished by a lifetime of discipline. He had built his empire on the foundation of being untouchable, unreadable, and invulnerable. This small, simple gesture of intimacy was a crack in that foundation, a betrayal of his own rigid code. He turned away from her, his jaw tight, and stared out at the dark, churning water of the river, a reflection of the turmoil he refused to let her see. The silence that fell between them was no longer just heavy. It was filled with the dangerous, beautiful, and terrifying thing they both refused to name. Maya's fear was no longer just for her own safety. It was evolving into a deeper, more complex terror. She was beginning to see the man behind the monster, the lonely soul trapped inside the king's gilded cage. She started to fear for him, for the part of him that was slowly, painfully reawakening in her presence. She knew that in his world, this kind of emotional connection was not a strength, but a fatal liability. Her empathy, the very core of her being, was now a source of profound anxiety. To care for Damien Valeriano was to stand at the edge of a cliff, knowing that the fall would not be hers alone. The stakes had been raised from her survival to his soul. He felt the change too. He began to see the city through her eyes. The callous ambition of the men he dealt with seemed uglier, the casual cruelty of the world more pronounced. Her quiet decency was a lens that clarified the moral filth in which he swam. It was making him reckless. He found himself altering his routes to catch a glimpse of her, manufacturing reasons to be near her, taking risks that his younger, colder self would have scorned. He was the most powerful man in the city's underworld, yet he was becoming undone by the quiet strength of a waitress who owned nothing but her own integrity. The thought was both infuriating and, in a secret, hidden part of his soul, exhilarating. The inevitable collision came on a cold Tuesday night. Maya was walking the few blocks from the bus stop to her apartment, the street unusually empty and silent. A car, not Damien's, slowed to a crawl beside her. The window rolled down and a man with a smile that didn't reach his cold, dead eyes leaned out. He was one of Damien's known rivals, a man named Marco Ricci. "Alvarez, right?" he said, his voice slick with false familiarity. "Damien seems to have taken an interest in you. And your little sister. Sophia. Such a pretty name." The casual mention of her sister's name was a knife twisting in her gut, a declaration that the fragile barrier between her life and his violent world had just been obliterated. Before she could run, before she could even scream, a second car screeched around the corner, its headlights cutting through the darkness like twin blades. It slammed to a halt, boxing Ricci's vehicle in. The driver's side door flew open and Damien emerged. He wasn't wearing his usual composed mask of control. His face was a canvas of pure, cold fury, an expression so terrifying it made the politician's tantrum seem like a child's game. Ricci's smirk vanished, replaced by the same primal fear she had seen once before. There were no words exchanged, only a silent, lethal promise that passed between the two men. Ricci's car sped away, tires squealing in retreat. Damien didn't spare the retreating car a second glance. His entire focus was on her, his stormy eyes blazing as he crossed the street in 3 long strides. He grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not painful, a gesture of pure, desperate urgency. "Get in the car," he commanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl that left no room for argument. He pulled her toward his vehicle, opening the passenger door and all but pushing her inside. The door slammed shut with a heavy, final thud, the sound echoing in the silence of the street. It was the sound of a cage door closing, sealing her inside his world, no longer as an observer, but as a participant. The heavy silence inside the car was a living thing, thick and suffocating, punctuated only by the rhythmic swish of the wipers against a sudden drizzle. The city lights smeared across the windows, a watercolor painting of a world that no longer felt real. Maya sat rigid, her hands clenched in her lap, the ghost of Ricci's leering smile burned into her mind.
Beside her, Damien was a statue carved from rage. He drove with a terrifying, focused calm, his hands gripping the leather-wrapped steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were bloodless peaks of white. The sheer force of his fury was a palpable presence in the enclosed space, a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the seat and into her very bones. It was a terrifying, primal anger, yet she knew with a dizzying certainty that none of it was directed at her. This realization was more frightening than any threat. The rage wasn't an attack. It was a shield, a wall of violence he had thrown up around her, and the implications of that were staggering. He was not merely an observer in her life, he had become its self-appointed, lethal guardian. She watched his profile, etched in sharp lines by the passing streetlights, and saw the immense, brutal control he was exerting over himself. He was a storm contained within the fragile shell of a man, and she was somehow standing in the eye of it. The instinct that had guided her entire life, to be small, to be quiet, to never make waves, screamed at her to remain silent. But something had shattered in her tonight, broken by the casual cruelty in Ricci's voice when he spoke her sister's name. Why? The word was a tear in the fabric of the silence, small and frayed, but undeniably present. It was the most reckless thing she had ever done. Her voice was barely a whisper, yet it struck the charged atmosphere like a hammer against glass. Damien's jaw tightened, a single hard muscle flexing along his cheek. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the rain-slicked ribbon of asphalt ahead. He was a man who commanded legions with a glance, who reshaped lives with a murmur, and she had just demanded an explanation from him. She had violated the unspoken terms of their arrangement, crossing a line from passive subject to active participant. She braced herself for the cold dismissal, the verbal slap that would put her back in her place, but it never came. Instead, the crushing silence stretched, drawn thin and taut until it was about to snap. He was fighting a war inside himself, the strategist battling the man, and for the first time, she could see the conflict raging behind his eyes. The city's neon glow bled into the car, painting his face in fleeting shades of red and blue, a visual representation of the turmoil he refused to voice. Her single question had become a challenge to his entire existence, forcing him to confront a motive that defied the cold logic of his world. Why her? Why risk exposure for a waitress from Queens? Why let a single piece of integrity disrupt a perfectly balanced empire of fear? The answer was a liability he could not afford, a truth he had never intended to speak aloud.
He finally spoke, his voice rough, as if torn from a place deep within him he kept locked away. Marco Ricci is a jackal who feeds on the weaknesses of other men. He still didn't look at her, the admission directed at the windshield, at the night itself. Tonight, he saw you, and he thought you were my weakness. The words were stark, stripped of all artifice. It was a confession, not of feeling, but of consequence. He was admitting that his presence in her life was not a shield, but a target, that in trying to protect her light, he had inadvertently painted her with the darkness of his own world. He had made her a pawn in a game where the price of losing was not just a job, but a life. It was the closest he had ever come to an apology. A cold dread washed over her, far colder than the rain outside. It wasn't the fear of being a target that chilled her to the bone. It was the sudden, gut-wrenching understanding of the burden he carried. She saw, in that moment, the crushing loneliness of his power. To be Damian Valeriano was to be eternally vigilant, to see every human connection a potential vulnerability, a flank to be attacked. His protection was a cage not just for her, but for him too. An overwhelming, unwanted wave of empathy rose in her chest. She wasn't just afraid for herself anymore. She was afraid for this dangerous, broken man who saw weakness in the one clean thing he had allowed into his life. The world had just tilted on its axis. With a sudden, sharp turn, he wrenched the car from the main road, pulling into the deep shadows of a deserted industrial alleyway. The engine cut out, plunging them into a profound, almost sacred silence, broken only by the soft ticking of the cooling engine. The city was a distant, muted glow. In this secluded darkness, they were the only two people in the world. He finally turned to face her, and the mask of the untouchable crime lord was gone. What was left was something raw and unguarded, his eyes a storm of emotions he could no longer contain, fury, regret, and a terrifying vulnerability that took her breath away. The air crackled, thick with everything they had never said. He reached across the space between them, his movement slow, deliberate, as if fighting against a lifetime of restraint. His fingers, surprisingly warm, brushed against her cheek. It was not a gesture of passion or possession, but one of profound, desperate reverence. He was touching her as if to reassure himself that she was real, that she was unharmed, that this one pure thing had not yet been tainted by the filth of his world. He had made her a pawn in a game where the price of losing was not just a job, but a life. It was the closest he had ever come to an apology.
In that single, silent contact, he confessed everything. He was not protecting an asset. He was protecting his own last hope for redemption. She did not flinch or pull away. She leaned into his touch, a silent acceptance of the impossible truth that now lay bare between them. In his eyes, she saw the ghost of a good man, the boy he might have been before the world had demanded he become a monster to survive. And he, in her stillness, in her unafraid gaze, saw the devastating power of a courage far greater than his own. It was not the courage to kill or to command, but the courage to remain decent in an indecent world. This quiet waitress, with her fierce integrity and her unshakable empathy, had just become the most dangerous person he had ever known, for she held the power to unravel him completely. He drew his hand back as if the touch had burned him, retreating into the fortress of his own silence. He turned his face away, staring at the brick wall of the alley, but the connection between them remained, a shimmering, unbreakable thread woven in the darkness. Everything had changed. The debt she owed was gone, replaced by a bond far more complex and perilous. He had broken his most sacred rule. He had allowed himself to care. And she had broken hers. She had looked into the heart of a monster and had not looked away. The engine was silent, the city was asleep, but for them, the world had just woken up. He drove her back to the edge of her world, the car a silent, moving vault cutting through the rain-soaked streets. The fury had receded, leaving behind a heavy, desolate calm. When he pulled to a stop a block from her building, he did not kill the engine. It was a clear, unspoken signal that this was the end of the line. He turned to her, and for a fleeting moment, the immense, crushing weight of his life was visible in the depths of his eyes. "This was a mistake," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp of finality. "From now on, you do not know me. We have never met. For your sister's sake and for yours, stay in the light, Maya." He used her name for the first time, and it was a goodbye. She got out of the car without a word, and did not look back as it disappeared into the wet, black night. Her apartment, once a sanctuary of solitude, now felt like a tomb. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was a hungry, echoing void where his presence used to be. She stood in the center of the small room, the damp chill of the night clinging to her coat, and felt the profound, irreversible shift in her own geography. He had not just entered her life, he had redrawn its borders, and now, in his absence, she was lost in this new, terrifying landscape. The memory of his touch on her cheek was a phantom brand, a constant, burning reminder of the line they had crossed. The safety of her anonymity was gone forever, shattered by a single act of impossible tenderness in a dark alley. The price of his protection, she now understood, was her peace. The days that followed were a study in gray. A thick, persistent drizzle seemed to settle over the city, mirroring the muted ache in her chest. She went to work, her movements automatic, a ghost haunting the periphery of other people's lives. The restaurant, with its petty dramas and false opulence, now seemed like a stage set for a play she was no longer in. Henderson's small cruelties glanced off her, failing to find purchase. In the past, she would scan the streets for the telltale silhouette of his car, a thrill of fear and anticipation coiling in her gut. Now, she looked for it out of a desperate, hollow habit, and its continued absence was a fresh wound each and every time. The city had never felt so vast, so empty. Damien retreated into the cold architecture of his empire, rebuilding the walls around his soul with a ruthless, calculated precision. He became a creature of pure, unadulterated control, his orders colder, his decisions sharper, his presence more intimidating than ever. He moved through his world of shadows and violence like a surgeon, excising any hint of sentimentality. The matter of Marco Ricci was handled with a brutal, silent efficiency that sent a tremor through the entire underworld, a message that Damien Valeriano's territory was absolute and his judgment final. Each ruthless act was a flagstone laid over the memory of her face, a desperate attempt to bury the one weakness he could not afford to possess. He was punishing the world for what he felt, and punishing himself most of all. For Maya, the sharp, initial pain of his withdrawal slowly began to transmute into a clear, cold lucidity. The fog of fear and fascination lifted, and she saw their connection for what it was, an impossible collision of two worlds that could only ever result in destruction. He was not her savior, but a storm that had passed over her life, leaving wreckage and a changed landscape in its wake. His final words were not a rejection, but a gift, the harshest, most necessary kindness he was capable of. She stopped looking for his car on the rain-slicked streets. She started instead to look at the photograph of Sophia, seeing not a chain, but an anchor, the unwavering moral compass that had kept her from being swept away entirely. She would stand at her window for hours, watching the rain trace jagged, lonely paths down the glass, blurring the distant city lights into a melancholy watercolor. Each drop that struck the pane felt like a second ticking by on an unseen clock, measuring the growing distance between their lives. The city, once a monolithic predator, now seemed to her a collection of a million separate, isolated souls, each contained within their own bubble of light and silence. His absence had carved out a space inside her, a quiet room of her own where she could finally begin to process the enormity of what had happened. The loneliness was no longer a weight pressing down, but the very air she breathed, sharp, clear, and cold. A month after he disappeared from her life, a thick, cream-colored envelope arrived bearing the seal of a prestigious law firm. It contained no letter of explanation, only official documents. A new charitable trust, established by an anonymous benefactor, had awarded her a full 4-year scholarship to Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, including a generous stipend for living expenses. Her dream, the one she had buried in a dusty box beneath her bed, had been resurrected and handed to her, complete and perfect. There was no name, no note, no clue as to its origin, but she knew. It was his final, definitive move, a gilded door to a future he had built for her, a future he could never be a part of. The documents lay spread across her small kitchen table, a blueprint for a new life. She felt no rush of elation, no thrill of victory. Instead, a profound and aching sadness settled over her, so heavy it was difficult to breathe. This wasn't just a gift, it was a severance. It was his way of pushing her back into the world of light, of making her so successful, so visible, that she could never again be drawn into his shadows. Accepting it meant agreeing to his terms. It meant acknowledging that the invisible thread between them was finally, irrevocably cut. It was the choice between the life she had always wanted and the ghost of a man she could never have. And the decision felt like an amputation of the soul. In his penthouse, overlooking the silent, glittering city, Damien received a one-word text message from his lawyer, accepted. He read the word, then deleted the message, his expression an unreadable mask of stone. He had done the right thing. He had used his power not to possess, but to liberate. He had corrected the imbalance in the universe that had allowed a woman of her substance to serve lesser men. It was a clean, logical, and just act. But as he stood before the vast expanse of glass, the city lights reflecting in his dark, empty eyes, he felt a hollowness so complete it threatened to consume him. He had saved her, but in doing so, he had damned himself to a loneliness more absolute than any he had ever known before. A deep and prolonged silence settled over both their lives. For her, it was the silence of a future waiting to be built, the quiet hum of possibility underscored by the constant, low echo of a profound loss. She held the scholarship papers, the key to her new world, and felt the weight of his final, unspoken words. For him, it was the silence of his self-imposed exile, the sterile quiet of a king on a throne in an empty room. The connection between them did not break. It simply stretched across an impossible distance, a single, sustained note of melancholy hanging in the vast, indifferent air of the city, a testament to what is lost when darkness does the right thing. The silence that followed was not an ending, but a long-held breath, a pause in a story that was far from over. What she chose to do with his impossible gift, and whether he could truly stay away, would determine everything. If you want to see how their paths cross again, like this video, share it with someone who loves an impossible story, and tell us in the comments what you hope happens next. 4 years later, the air was different. It smelled not of expensive perfume and seared scallops, but of old paper, drafting ink, and the electric hum of ambition. Maya stood before a panel of architectural masters in a sun-drenched auditorium at Columbia University, her final thesis project displayed on a large screen behind her. She was no longer a ghost in a black uniform, but a creator, her voice steady and clear as she explained the fluid lines of a public library to be a sanctuary for the city's forgotten. The exhaustion that once lived in her bones had been replaced by a quiet, hard-won confidence, yet in the deepest part of her soul, she still felt the phantom weight of a shadow, a silent benefactor whose existence was both a gift and a haunting. The presentation was going well until Professor Alistair Finch, a man renowned for his intellectual cruelty, began his critique. His words were not academic, they were scalpels, intended to dissect and destroy. He attacked her concept of sanctuary as naive, her use of light as sentimental, his voice dripping with the same condescending disdain as the politician from that fateful night. Maya felt the old, familiar heat of shame rise in her cheeks, the room shrinking, the faces of the other panelists blurring. She braced herself, her hands clenching into fists at her sides, refusing to let him see her break. She had fought too hard to be diminished by another small man's ego, but the echo of her past was deafening. Just as Finch was winding up for his final killing blow, a subtle vibration broke the tension. A sleek black phone on the table before him lit up with a text message. He glanced down, annoyed at the interruption. His expression froze. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, waxen mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He swallowed hard, his sharp, critical eyes darting around the room as if searching for an unseen threat. The momentum of his attack shattered, his venomous words dissolving into a choked silence. The other panelists exchanged confused glances, but Maya knew. A cold certainty washed over her. The ghost in her machine had just made his presence known. Finch cleared his throat, his voice now a strained, reedy whisper. Upon further reflection, he stammered, unable to meet her gaze, the design shows considerable promise, a bold vision. He offered no further comment, sinking back into his chair, a man utterly broken. The rest of the review was a formality. Maya answered their questions in a daze, her mind not on the complex structural calculations, but on the invisible, lethal force that had just intervened on her behalf. She had built a new life, brick by brick, but she now understood with chilling clarity that its foundation had been laid and protected by a power she could never truly escape. He had promised to stay in the darkness, but his shadow was long. After receiving her diploma, a document that felt both earned and given, she walked out into the crisp afternoon air. Her classmates were celebrating, their laughter echoing across the campus lawn, but Maya felt a magnetic pull toward the street. She stood on the top step of the Grand Library, clutching the leather-bound portfolio to her chest. Across the avenue, a familiar black sedan was parked in a no-standing zone, its engine purring silently. The windows were deeply tinted, impenetrable shields of privacy. For a long, suspended moment, she simply stared, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The car did not move. It was just there, a silent witness to her triumph, a final, unspoken confirmation. Then, as if acknowledging her gaze, the car smoothly pulled away from the curb and merged into the relentless river of city traffic, disappearing in seconds. He was gone. This time there was no sadness, no aching loss, only a profound, quiet understanding. His final act was not to possess her, but to ensure her freedom was absolute. He had used the darkness to protect her light, a final, selfless act of redemption. She looked up at the Manhattan skyline, the impossible, beautiful structures she would now help to build, and a small, bitter smile touched her lips. Some debts, she realized, are not meant to be paid, but to be lived. And if their story moved you, if you believe that even in the deepest shadows a sliver of light can survive, subscribe for more. Like this video and share the hope.